Let's make a start. Okay, so last week I was going through a number of technical things. So bear in mind the next lab is going to be more difficult than the previous ones. Some of the source code is already uploaded on the resources there, and hopefully at least one video is available. If the others are available, I will make sure that they're available for tomorrow. So we're covering a tricky part of the course, covering the technical material necessary to sort of build the part of the web application that's to do with users being able to submit data. Once you've got the hang of making your web app do this, you can really start to add functionality and build out the core of your website. It is tricky. Please come and talk to me and ask me questions in the labs. I will help you through this part of it. Once we've got through this, there is a little bit in the lab after that, which is to do with the saving to the database and the loading from the database, which I showed in the second lecture on Friday. And I'll upload a video about that as well. And then for the rest of the course, it is the labs don't really cover much technical material. Okay, so most of the labs are to do with user testing and testing the product, and the labs are there to get support for your individual requirements for your project. And the lectures will be a mixture of sort of more traditional software engineering things, talking about design and various stuff like that. But also, mostly, the lectures will consist of helping you with specific features that you might want in your project. So there's certain things we will cover, which are things like the login system and search functionality. We'll have a quick look at things like cookies to support that, JavaScript and asynchronous JavaScript. Again, with each of these, we're not going to go into great detail. They're going to be enough so you can see something you can make. But if you really want to make something special, then you will need to study that separately. Either at W3 Schools or Code Academy, some combination of the two will give you an excellent background in those things. So today, I'm just going to cover a little bit more technical material, which will take everything we did last week and just take it a little bit further, which most of you will want to do, as I'll show you in a moment. And then we're going to review a variety of things, a sort of eclectic collection of ideas that were sort of cut from the previous presentations for time, and they cover a variety of sort of software engineering and project management ideas. Okay. Okay. So explicitly, a lot of what we were talking about in the last Friday's lecture, as well as explicitly how to save to the database and load from the database, was also this idea about NoSQL. Databases, how the entries in the NoSQL database can be of varying size, and that makes it relatively easier to construct more complicated structures. And there's a lot of interesting things about NoSQL databases, and that's why it's good to use them. The other reason it's good to use them is because it enables you to use Java classes, so you can use exactly the same structure you use for runtime as you use for storage, which makes your life a lot easier. I talked a little bit about how you can implement things like lists and graphs through your web page, and I'll show you some examples of that as well. And then we're talking a little bit about the importance of, so the last lab, the design lab, you sort of work in isolation. you're in the sense that each of you submit an end user, each of you submit a customer, but you may not really have clarified exactly what your project is. Some of those end users and customers and features may not be compatible with one another. An important point to add relating to this, so I've received a few emails from people saying, I have a teammate or I have more than one teammate that isn't doing any work, and is behind the labs or hasn't turned up to the labs. If you receive an email saying you haven't been at the labs, make sure you turn up at them, and then you didn't turn up at the next lab as well, then you are off your team. So if other people are experiencing teammates that haven't turned up to 2 labs consecutively, then that teammate is off your team. So I haven't updated the web app yet to sort of reflect that, but that is effectively how it works. So if you're one of the people who has been booted off your team, then you're doing the web app project on your own. Okay? And you experience a penalty for that as well. If you have exceptional circumstances, get them in quickly and tell me quickly so that I can put you back on the team. If you don't have exceptional circumstances, you're off the team. In the rare case that you're the only person left on your team because everybody else has been kicked off it, then we can have a discussion about whether you want to do the project on your own or whether you want to try to join another team. Okay? So that is a possibility. Right. Oh, another thing to mention, I've had a few emails about the grading. So there was an issue with the grading. It was possible to submit a grading that would sort of break the grading page if your submission has certain HTML in certain places. And that should be fixed now. So for those of you who have a grading page with some red in it that you couldn't click submit, hopefully that now works. A couple of people have mentioned that they submitted gradings and it hasn't been recorded. There is one situation in which that can happen. So when you go to the grading page, say you're in the lab and you go to the grading page, what the web app will do is it will lock that submission as associated with you for 24 hours. So if you go to that page and you look at that page, you've locked that for 24 hours. If you take longer than 24 hours to grade that submission, then you lose that locked submission. Okay? So if you spend more than 24 hours between the time you went to the page and the time you press submit, then you will do a submission, but the web app will ignore that submission because you no longer have a lock on it. Okay? So it doesn't happen very often, but a few people may have had issues, and that is probably the cause. There's always a possibility there is some other bug with the web app, so we'll look into that in each case, but I'm fairly sure that's probably the issue that some people are facing. So if in doubt, just refresh the grading page before you submit your grading, and then you'll know whether or not you've still got the same one or not. Okay, so what are we talking about today? Right. So the place we left off on Friday was a web page. I'll just show you what it looks like. So let's have a look. Got that. Okay, so where we left off was information was being saved to the database and loaded back in. So I've just loaded it in and it still has the random stuff that I added last time. So we had a news event and the code, if we have a look at the code for doing it. Okay, so right? So what the code would do is it would go through every news event in the database, and it would create that sort of title. So if we zoom out and switch over, right? It would create this bit here. And then for every news event has got an array list of stories, which are strings, and each string is like a unique ID associated with a particular submission of a news story. So a news story in this case is these things here. Okay. So we've got a loop going through these names. We're grabbing the name. We're opening up a map. So that's what MV stores name for something like a table. If you're used to tables in SQL databases, that's what a map is. And a map maps between a unique name that's a string and a Java object, which in this case is a news story. So it grabs each one in turn and it creates that little blue panel thing, and that this HTML is making that blue panel, and then it gives it the appropriate title. Okay. And then there's some code down here which we were also going through, which was a form which enables users to submit new news stories and associate them with the news event. That's what we're going through on Friday. So one of the things we talked about on Friday was this use of the path, that you could make these sort of multiple sort of special paths, which are kind of like function calls, if you like, that are how the web server responds to forms being submitted. And in this particular example, it was making a news story and saving it to the database and associating it with the news event. Okay, so all that's fine. The problem is that if your website consists of just every single piece of data that you have in the database, followed by every single sub-detail of that thing, you're going to end up with one massive page that's kind of hard to deal with. So how else could we do it? Well, if you go to a website like Amazon, you'll notice as you click on products, you'll get a sort of long string of characters in the path. And those string of characters are a unique ID associated with the product. And internally in Amazon, they have some kind of web application, a bit like this, where whenever a company or Amazon themselves want to submit a new product, they fill in the details about the product, the picture of it, and everything else. They click submit. The Amazon web app creates a unique ID for that, and then it's also basically created a unique page for that. And the unique page is a combination of some meaningful strings like product and something like that, and then a load of sort of code, like a unique number, a unique ID associated with that product. Okay? So we sort of want to do the same thing. So it would be quite nice, for example, if we had one page that just showed all the news events, and then we could click on one of those news events, and then we would go to a page just about that news event, and on that page you could then look at the stories. So how could we implement that, right? So this is where I go to one I created earlier. Okay, so I'll run this and show it working, and then I'll show you how it does it. Okay, so in this version, we've got the news event. So if we had more news events, we'd see more news events on this page. But if we click on this, we're now going to a different URL. Okay, so /event/ and then a unique number. And that's the unique number associated with that news event. So in this particular case, we gave news events unique IDs in the database, and those unique IDs were timestamps that we were getting from the system. So that's basically where that number comes from. So if you happen to be able to read system time, you can work out at what time that was run originally. So then when we look at the page, it looks a lot closer to the page we had previously. And then if I add some example story, we can see it's all working the same way as the previous one. But in this case, we're only dealing with a single news event here, rather than a whole list of them. So how does that work in the code? All right, let's have a look. Okay, so much of the page remains the same, and the top remains the same, because remember the first page that we were looking at, the main index page, is the one that shows all the news events. So it still opens up the database
map of news events. It gets all the unique names for all the news events. Now, as I'll mention in a moment, you can use a similar trick to introduce pages. So you could split this up by page, but I don't want to complicate things too much at the moment. So in this case, it's going through every single news event. And in this case, it's just stopping. It's just this bit for every news event. So previously, we had a loop that added in search for news stories and added the form and did all those other things as well. But we've cut down the code enormously. And now, instead of just having a heading, it has an A tag, basically a link, an HTML link. And the link it's href equals. And so because this is all just a string, we can modify that string and add the unique ID of the news event. Okay? So we're constructing a path out of our specialized name, or sort of function call, if you like, and this extra content which defines the unique ID. So one of the reasons you want to do it this way, rather than, say, using a form or something like that, is that if someone bookmarks this page, it will all still work. Okay? So this is still like a URL page that you can remember. You can email it to somebody else, and it will all just work. Okay? So so we have a link. Now we want to be able to respond to this link. So last time we made a function here which showed you how you can make sort of specialized paths if you want to sort of respond to effects. And that was the specialized path for submitting a news story. So we just add another one. Now, up until recently, we've been matching the path against a literal string. Okay, so it was either up at the top, we were matching against index.html, and here we're matching against index.html / whatever we want to call this sort of function call, if you like. But what we're doing here is we just want to match the beginning bit of it, because every page is unique. So if we use .startsWith, then that will catch every single one of these up here, every single one of these links, regardless of what the unique ID happens to be, because it's just matching the front bit of the URL. Okay. So we match the front bit, but then what we want to do is we want to get that unique ID out again. So if you use .substring, what that does is if you give it a number, it will take a string, and then depending on the number indicates how many characters to step over. It will then give you the string from then on. Okay? So this bit of code here is saying how many characters make up this bit, which is the bit at the front, and then just do the rest. So what that will give you is this bit here, the unique ID that was added on the end. This bit will be cut off, and that bit will be left. Okay. So once we've got a unique ID here, then we have a little preamble that just makes the title bar and stuff like that. Then we can get that specific news event out of the map and carry on very similarly to how we were doing previously, using its title to construct the page, going through the stories and doing each of the bits. But now we have a page per entry in the database. Okay? Okay, so this is just summarizing it again in the slides to make it a bit easier if you want to look for it. Okay, so you can use the same idea where you're constructing a string out of code and then matching against that part, the first part of it, to do things like pages. So if you have 10 articles per page or something like that, then you can thing that responds to that particular path, and it will just skip to that point in the list of news events for whatever page you have to be dealing with. Just print out 10 and then exit. Okay? So I leave that for those most who are enthusiastic to try it out. If you need any help with this, just come and talk to me in labs, ask me questions, I can help you out with this. Does anyone have any questions about those things? Okay, so with this capability, you can now have a relatively small amount of code and an extremely complicated website or representation of information. So another thing we talked about on Friday was this idea that sometimes you want basically a graph. So you want objects pointing to other objects. So one of the examples with this was saying that whenever you submit a news story, for example, you might want to select the journalist that wrote the news story. And in that case, the journalist, assuming the journalist already exists in your database somewhere, you actually want to point to that particular journalist. So one way you can do that is that you can have an input type on your form, which is basically a drop-down list. And you fill it with all the instances of the thing you're going to link to, and you can just pick the one you want. There's lots of other ways of doing it, but that's kind of the simplest way you can do it. So let's see what that looks like. Okay. So in this particular code, which I will upload and set in the resources as well, so this is on the page for the specific news event. So that page, if we have a look at it, you can see it has this form here as well. And it also has a drop-down list where we can pick a journalist. So these journalists, there'll be some other page that you submit information about journalists, and that's a separate form, right? But how do you implement this drop-down list? That's the question. Okay, so you can see how we did that. So just like everything else, there's a model associated with the thing. So every real-world thing you have associated with your website, you want a class in the model directory for it. That's one for journalists. And you want a map for that information as well. So we have a map of journalists with unique IDs. And this does the same hacky thing I was showing before. If the database happens to be empty, for testing purposes, some example journalists are automatically added, just so that you can check the whole system is working. Okay, so then what it's doing, if you have a look at this, is that this is a form. If I find a bit, yeah, okay, there we go. So this is a form. It's just like the form we were showing in the previous example. But this form has also got a new input type called a select. And that's basically a drop-down list, okay? And just like normal input types, it needs a name in order for that information to be passed along. And so what this code here does is it loops through all the journalists in the table, in the map, and it adds this line. And this line uses value, so this is the information that's going to be passed through to the server. It's not something that you see. And it uses the journalist name to show the Bob Woodward or Glenn Greenwald examples. Okay? And if you do that, then as people add journalists to your website, this drop-down list will get bigger. Okay. Now, in theory, if you have a massive website, you need a more substantial solution for selecting things. And then you would need something more complicated, probably involving JavaScript and things like that. But for simpler cases, a drop-down list will largely cover you. Okay. So we can just see how that information is then used. Sorry if I get to the right thing. Okay, So this is the code we had before, which was about submitting a news story. I don't know if I've actually done it here. No, I'm not actually using it, sorry. What we can do at this point is we could do toProcess.params.get and then use this journalist, what did I call it here? It's up here. There we go. We called it journalist, name of journalist. So we can get that back again just as we would if it was a text box, for example. So in the same way we're doing toProcess.params get title, we can do toProcess.params get journalist. And then we can store that journalist information associated with the news stories, just like we associate stories with news events. Okay? So in that way, you can link these sort of graph-like structures together and make more complicated web apps. Enable the web apps to create more complicated structures. Okay. Okay, so this is just a little detail to do with models. I think a very small number of you started looking at things like how you can get data into the database. And I'll get back to you on how you can do that in a moment. But one thing to bear in mind is we're using the Java serialization. So Java, all objects in Java, you can automatically convert into a sequence of bytes using the Java language itself. It will do that for you. And it's using a thing called Java serialization. So you just do implements serializable on any Java object, and you can save it to disk and load it from disk. And that's what the MV store is using to save the information into the database and load it back again. However, as you're developing your web application, it's likely that you will change the information that you store in your model. And whenever you change that structure, that means that when the information is trying to be loaded back in again, there'll be some conflict, okay, because the representation isn't quite the same. Now, Java serialization is very clever, so it will typically try to do its best if you force it to. But by default, if you just do implement serializable, it will say, these two objects have a different signature, I refuse to load this data. And then you'll have to manually delete the .mv database file that's created in the same directory as your HTTP docs folder. Okay? And then you'll have to get rid of any data that you had in the database. Okay? Which is generally not a problem while you're developing, but it can be an issue. In Java, if you add a private static final long serial version UID and give it a number, that's you overriding Java's default behavior. So its default behavior is to calculate a unique signature, a unique number associated with a Java class based on what variables you've added to it. So every time you add a variable or remove a variable, you'll get a new code. And so serialization will refuse to attempt to load that object off disk. If you explicitly add this variable to your class, you're saying that you will decide when the object is changed enough that you don't want to load it anymore. Okay? So what that means is, say you just put that line in, which just says it's got a unique code of 1, and you never change that. And you add a load of variables, and you remove a load of variables, and you change the order of the variables, and that kind of thing. Java serialization will try to guess how to load those bytes from disk. So there's certain operations you can do, and it will be fine with. So for example, if you just add the variables to the serialization process, if you load up an object that doesn't have those variables in place, it will just store them as null. So it's quite clever. It can deal with a certain amount of change. If you change the type of a named variable, for example, it won't be able to deal with that, and then it will typically throw an exception. Okay? So that's just a little detail if you start adding content while you're developing the structure. It didn't apply to many people last year, but it's important that you're aware of it just in case you encounter the problem. Okay, so one thing I'll keep repeating all the way through the course And it's something that, unfortunately, there's a lot of software developers that don't really appreciate. In fact, I'll tell you another anecdote. Has anyone here heard of a thing called the Mythical Man Month? Okay, not very many. So it's quite a famous book in software engineering. It was written by, partly in the result of somebody who's dealing with IBM. So IBM, one of the first computer companies in the world, and they, as a company, decided that they would judge whether you were a good programmer based on how many lines of code you wrote. So internally, as a company, they encouraged people to write loads and loads of code because that's how they were judged and that's how they were promoted. And the Mythical Man Month is primarily about the idea of if you add more people to a project that's running late, it causes chaos and makes the project run later. But this is also another point that was raised, which is the idea that complexity is your enemy. So if you want to make a web app, if you want to make a piece of software that is really amazing, which has lots of facets to it, does complicated things, and I always give the example of game engines because I think they're amazing, but something like that, something which is so many different parts, they all have to link together and work together. What you want is you want a single person to be able to keep that structure in their mind. Because as soon as your program is more complicated than a single person can store in their mind, you have to sort of start splitting up the program into smaller pieces and be very careful about how they talk to one another. Otherwise, you end up with something that nobody really understands at all, and they sort of prod to try and make it work. So managing the complexity of what you make is a crucial skill in software development. And an easy mistake for a lot of people to make is to think, I have done something good because I have done a lot of something. So one thing you should always ask yourself is, when you've written a lot of code, what is that code actually doing? Is it actually contributing functionally in making something? So this whole idea of trying to simplify the understanding of how a structure works or an application works, it's reflected in different ways. There's different strategies for doing that. The most common one for web applications is the idea that you want to try to split your application up into these separate 3 parts. And these 3 parts are classes or code or however you want to group them together that are associated with how information is stored. And that makes sense in and of itself. And so separately from that, you have functions that deal with control, which is changing things. So if you think of the example I was showing you there, we have an if block, which is to do with responding to a request from a form. That's a load of code that's acting as in a control case. It's changing the database in some way. And then we have a lot of code, typically, that is about visualizing information. So we try to keep the code separate in some way, at least separate in our minds, so that it makes it easier to think about how the program is working. So I thought I'd mention that because it's very, very widely used. MVC, MCV, depends on who you're asking, structure things. But it's less important that you do that. It's certainly not important that you don't adhere to any of these principles in a sort of religious way. The thing that is crucially important is that your application is simple, is relatively easy to understand. And there's a real art to creating sophisticated programs that don't have a lot of code, or more importantly, can easily fit in your mind, right? That's the true goal that you have whenever you're making software. Okay, that is the core of the things I wanted to talk about there with regards to state and making stuff to do with the web app. Here are a few more sort of software development ideas which hopefully you'll find interesting and useful. Right, so this is how to make a product, a good product, the game's way. Okay, so one of the things I love about working in the games industry is they have very, very high standards for products, much higher than a lot of, say, corporate software. And one of the things about game products, which is great, is that you can't just appeal, you can't schmooze a customer and then hand over something that's awful for an end user to use. If people don't like playing the game, they don't buy it. So it's a very, it's quite a cutthroat business in some ways.
And so one of the things about the way that games are developed, at least the way they're developed now, is to minimize the risk of making something that nobody likes, and to focus very heavily on the core of the experience of the product and ensure that that is very, very appealing to the end user of the customer. Okay? So anyway, right. So the key to this is, first of all, we develop the idea. That's the idea of the design lab that we're dealing with. And then we're looking at creating a prototype. So creating as rough a version as we can, and experimenting with that. So any design industry, any creative industry, to be honest, anyone who makes anything should be focused on this. In what way can I make a version of this product that is as fast to make as possible? So I'm going to draw something on paper, I'm going to show it to a customer, I'm going to try and learn as much as I can about the product without putting very much time into actually making it. Okay? Now, one of the things that was one of the changes that came about as games became larger projects and the budgets got really big and things like this was the introduction of this thing that's often called a vertical slice. So most games are concerned, in fact most products are similar, and certainly the products that you're looking at are very like this. They have a core experience. So in most computer games, for example, you have multiple levels that are variations of the core experience. So the core experience might be fighting, might be driving, whatever it happens to be. And the vertical slice is saying, if you were to use a more traditional software engineering approach that you don't tend to use anymore, you would have gone out and you would have collected a whole bunch of requirements that you would have tried to guess that the customer wanted, or you'd asked the customer, and you would have made a list. And then you would have constructed a plan where at the end of the plan, which is the end of the time and budget of your project, everything would be finished. And you would just work on things in parallel and sort of hope that they all came together again. Right? Typically that leads to projects that aren't very good. So the idea of the vertical slice is to say, what is essential about this product? What is the most important interaction the person has with this product? And let's make that, and make that as good as you possibly can do. And actually, for those of you who are interested in the history of games, a lot of this comes from Half-Life. So Half-Life is an amazing game, amazing, dramatically better than other games. One of the reasons it was dramatically better than other games was it was created by a game studio that was run by two ex-Microsoft employees who were rich because they had been part of the IPO. So they were rich enough that they made an entire game, and they looked at it and they said, well, we can ship that, that's okay, but instead, why don't we just take the best bits of every level of this game and make one amazing level, and then make all the other levels again at the same standard as this one level. And that's where the idea of the vertical slice comes from, is that if you just make one core part of the experience as good as you possibly can, then everything else, you try to maintain that standard all the way through the things that you make. So that's the core idea from the game's point of view. And this is the whole idea of you focusing on what is distinctive about your product. If there's something which is a piece of work that isn't part of the core experience that you're offering to your customer, say it's a contact us page or something like that, it's tangentially important. That's something you can leave until later. Find the meatiest part of your project, make sure that's working well. And keep working on whatever the core thing is, particularly the distinctive thing you're adding to your product. And keep working on that from the beginning all the way through your project. Okay? So once you've done that vertical slice, that is your design document. That is your vision for the product. It's a part of your product that's raised all the way almost to shippable quality level. But it only represents a part of your project. And then everything else then becomes more mechanical. You're just repeating that process, that success that you've made previously. And then there's a rather predictable process towards the end, where you're fixing bugs in your software. You would go through a very systematic process in games. You have like a whiteboard up, and in games you have paid people to test your software for you and find bugs in it. And you have a big list of bugs, and then people would allocate the bugs to people. They wipe them off the whiteboard. It's quite an intense period, but it's one where it is a very, very controlled, predictable process. Okay?
and then you have launch and support and things like this. But there's a few principles which are always held throughout the project. The first one is that the project should always be runnable. So in the old days, you would have just had all the features, you would have allocated responsibilities to different people. Someone would have done search, someone would have done comments, whatever, and you would have just hoped that they would plug together at the end, and that's largely what you would have done. The whole idea of this is the game or the product, whatever it happens to be, you should be able to load that up from the beginning and use it and have it in a usable state from as early as possible all the way through to the end. Okay? That means you have to fix serious bugs. That means that things should be integrated early if possible. And the changes to your product, you assume that changes are a critical thing. It takes a lot of time. So if you started designing a structure for your product, that means that someone has to spend 10 minutes before they can add an entry or make a modification to the data structure behind your web app. You started to introduce a big delay in the process. And that means you're going to do less iterations, which means you're going to have less polish, which means your product's going to be worse. Sure. The other reason why you need a usable, runnable thing from as early as possible all the way through is because in games, for financial reasons, for marketing reasons, and for user testing reasons, you need to have the ability to turn around a demo all the way through the development of your product. Okay, that's another reason why you don't just go off in silos and make your own thing and put it together. You need the product itself to be growing all the way as you're developing what you do. Okay, and you want to test with users because your feedback from users, the more iterations you get from that, the higher quality your product will be. And that's the key to making high quality products. So again, that's based on the worldview where you say customers don't know what they want. You can guess what they want until they have something realistic in front of them and they try using it. Only then do you really know what the design should be. Okay? And yes, as I say, you've got to provide confidence to the people who pay you. So that's basically that's the high-level structure of how you make a high-quality product for end users. Okay, here's another thing, right. Has anyone ever heard the phrase bike shedding before? I was in fear that it was some kind of foreign term, but as far as I know, okay. Yeah, I'll give you another foreign anecdote. When I was in games, I would do a lot of my job towards the end of my time in games was coming up with game concepts, and we would make presentations all the time, so we would constantly be on Google Images searching for images, or for whatever topic it happened to be. And one day, we typed in bus stop, and for some reason, it was nothing but porn. And it's just like, suddenly the Google algorithm must have failed, or I don't know exactly what was going on. For some reason, it was nothing but porn. Anyway, that's an aside. Anyway, bike shedding has nothing to do with pornography, or at least not the context in which I'm talking about it. Okay, so on Wikipedia has a slightly safer term, law of triviality. So this is based on a real anecdote of somebody who's at a local council meeting somewhere in England. I can't remember the exact name, but and at this council meeting, they were approving a £10 million leased nuclear power station, and they were also discussing how the bike sheds, I think, should be locked or secured in some way in their local area, and they were also determining how the group would pay for biscuits for tea. And they spent about 5 to 10 minutes dealing with the 10 million nuclear power station. They spent almost all of their time talking about the bike shed issue, and then the biscuits issue ran for several days to be resolved. So what's the point of this anecdote? Well, it's saying that the easier someone can imagine the issues associated with something, the more people will spend time talking about it. And it's why meetings are often a waste of time. Because if you're not aware of this, people will naturally do it. The more personal example of this is whenever you're developing software or developing a product, you will be naturally attracted to the parts of the product that you feel comfortable making. So products will often look sort of out of balance because there will be a lot of whatever you currently know, and you will tend to sort of avoid the bits that you think are tricky. So be aware that all humans naturally do this,
kind of a cognitive flaw that we all have. So what I try to do is whenever I'm making a product, I try to sort of feel, in a Zen, Jedi Master kind of way, which part of the project am I stressed about? What kind of bothers me the most? And that's sort of like, I often refer to it as the bit of me that doesn't talk. It's much smarter than I am, telling me that's the bit that you are secretly avoiding doing. And that's the bit that you need to sort of force yourself to pay attention to and learn about. Okay? And what you'll find, actually, another thing, so what I often refer to as sort of the bad old days of software engineering, a lot of it is about bureaucracy, making documents, very ritualistic ways of trying to identify what requirements there are, and all these kinds of things. These are bureaucracy, and most times, it's basically another form of pipe shaving. People who are kind of stressed and unsure about what they should be making try to hide the uncertainty they have about whether their product is going to be a success by doing a ritualistic process. So you can write loads and loads of documentation, and you feel like you've done something useful because it was easy to write the documentation. Or you can follow a ritualistic process, and you can think, oh, I'm a professional now because I did all this stuff. When in reality, the ultimate determination of whether you've made something which is good or not is whether people like it and you can use it well. Okay, so no amount of bureaucracy will ever fix that. Okay, another thing to add, we're not done, quite done yet, is just to say something very important, which hopefully if you don't already know it, then you'll know it soon, that it's really important to stay in contact with people. So if you're on any group project or anything like that, it's important to have regular meetings. I mentioned before this idea of forming, storming, norming, performing. If you don't meet regularly, you won't pass through those stages. And if you don't meet regularly, you will start to dislike each other. There's all kinds of animalistic, psychological reasons why this happens, but you will start to become in separate groups. It's important that you're physically together when you work on projects. All of these things will have a big impact on what you're making and what you're doing. Okay, so make sure you turn up. And like I say, already you haven't experienced it yet, so I haven't sent any emails, but people who haven't engaged with their teams will be doing this stuff on their own, and they basically lost a degree of classification because they haven't, for this module at least, haven't engaged with their team. It is essential that you do this. If you're in a company and you try not to not behave in this way, you will just not pass probation and you'll never be hired in the first place. So make sure you stay in contact with each other. I mentioned previously this idea of unified design, which is very closely related to this idea of working in teams. If you fracture and don't cooperate and make your own stuff, it's really obvious in the product that gets made. And there's all kinds of funny anecdotes of ridiculous products that have, say, multiple read me first text files included in them when they get shipped, that kind of nonsense. So in order to make good things, you have to work together. And that's one of the key things that you're learning in this module. Okay, quick things before we go. So when you're selling a product, ultimately it's basically reputation. And they're convinced, people are convinced that your product is good because they've seen something that they like. It's the most convincing way that someone will decide that they like what you're involved with. The first user experience is vitally important. That's why the whole point of the vertical slice. You want to refine as much as possible what is the first page, what are the first few things the user does. They should be as enjoyable as possible because they're the first user's experience with things. And our final slide, you'll be glad to know, is for yourselves. Okay? So you're going to be trying to get placement, you're going to try and get your first job. The question is, what is going to be most convincing to someone who's going to hire you? Now, if you work for a large corporation, or get a job for a large corporation, some of those companies will just assume that they can psychologically mold you and make you into whatever, as long as you're suitably obedient. And then they will just look at your CV and they will hire you on the basis of that. Okay? I'm not sure that's the best job you can get, but there's certainly one path. Better jobs are jobs where they're hiring you because of what you can already do. So the question is, how the hell do you get your first job because you have no prior experience? So a lot of people who end up with very good jobs when they graduate, on this course for example, have done their own projects, or their final year projects have been very good, or their first year web apps are very good. They can go to someone and they can say, look, here's the thing I really made, I can already make it, I have the skills that you want, and on the basis of that you can be hired. Okay? To get the best jobs in the world, they are not advertised. The best jobs in the world, they come to you. And they come to you because the world already knows who you are. Because you make great things and you share them online and people know about your products. And then you acquire a reputation in an industry. And that's very difficult to do from the beginning, but there's a small number of students every year who do manage to achieve that. And it's one of my goals to help as many students get into that situation as possible. So, okay, I hope that's been helpful for you. Thank you very much.